Welcome to the Real News Network, and welcome to our viewers watching us live on Facebook. Joining me today is Green Party candidate Joshua Harris. Thanks so much for joining us, Joshua.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
So we're going to be talking live on Facebook right now, taking your questions, so make sure, viewers, you're sending them in. Joshua Harris, we're just days away from the election. You're running a Green Party campaign in a city that for many years has been solidly Democrat. Most people take it for granted that a non-Democratic candidate has a chance at this. What sets you apart from the other candidates?
I'm just really excited. One, this is also the first time that the Baltimore City has had a candidate for mayor that is in the Green Party. And so we're making history here. And so, of course, me being a Green sets me apart from the other candidates. None of them are Green Party members. But most importantly, I think that it's important to understand that all candidates are going to tell you that they want to fix education. They're all going to tell you that they want to fix roads. They're all going to tell you that they want to fix our schools and our crumbling infrastructure and our vacant housing problem. And they should want to. The difference between me and them is that I'm the only candidate in this race to release a plan for how we pay for those improvements without increasing property taxes. Traditional wisdom usually tells you either you have to cut something or you have to increase property taxes. In my 21-page economic development plan, we use innovative approaches and go directly into specifics on how we can leverage the city's budget to make those, to leverage and create wealth to make those improvements. Because if we don't have a way to finance it, it's just broken promises. And I didn't want that, which is why we released the economic development portion first. So when I say that I want to make schools better and we're going to improve infrastructure, I can tell you how I'm going to pay for it because we've already dealt with that component of it. Because
a lot of what you hear is that the city is broke, but the city does have a pretty, fairly large budget. So you're saying the city is not broke. You're saying we can pay for it with the existing money that's already there. How are we going to do that?
Absolutely. It's really understanding what Senator Bernie Sanders talked about so much in his national campaign, Wall Street, and how it impacts us locally, how we can remove ourselves from his grip, and how we can take control of our economic futures by simply leveraging the $2.7 billion budget that we have guaranteed every year through property taxes and other revenue, and using that the same way that the bank that it's sitting in right now is using it, and making investments, except for instead of those investments going back to some rich Wall Street banker, they come back to the citizens of Baltimore. And so by doing that and leveraging what we already have the exact same way that any other banking institution would, but open up in our own Baltimore City Public Bank, we can reap tremendous benefits through interest earned and interest gained. Even just by starting with our rainy day fund, which is $98 million that's sitting there just in case something happens. By piloting a Baltimore City Public Bank with that, the interest we could earn in the first 6 months alone on $98 million, we could do tremendous things in our schools, like give them heat, or begin to replace the pipes and the plumbing so that the kids can drink the water. Because we talk about Flint and their crisis with water, Baltimore City is in just as bad of a position, if not worse, knowing that our water runs through miles and miles of lead pipes, and we have to replace all this infrastructure. We can't just simply switch our water supply. And this is something that isn't being talked about, knowing that lead has been a major issue in Baltimore City for decades now, and it's something that is yet to be effectively or substantively addressed, and how it's impacted future generations from lead poisoning. And so it's something that we definitely need to deal with, but we need the financing capability to do that.
And that was highlighted in the death of Freddie Gray, because that was one of the issues that he faced growing up, living in a hyper-segregated neighborhood, suffering from lead poisoning that led him down a certain path because of the situation that he came into. So I want to talk a little also about criminal justice, because a big part of our budget, something like $500 million, goes to cops and courts. Would you maintain that level of funding, or would you try to reallocate that? And how would you do that while you maintain safety, which is a top priority for the city's residents?
Absolutely, that's a great question. And so for me, I come from a slightly different background, and when we talk about young people shaping the conversations around policy, and we talk about protest and activism, I'm looking to go from protest to policy. And so really understanding criminal justice from that perspective, and from an equity perspective, I had a conversation yesterday with someone, and we were talking about the school to prison pipeline. And so our city has a $480 million police operating budget. It's larger than our education budget, our housing budget, and our health budgets combined. And yet policing in itself is reactive in nature. And so we're investing in the back end rather than on the front end. If we invested in parks and recs, in education, in health, in housing, we could prevent from having to invest in policing on the back end. And so the way that we've invested our money has been very reactive in nature. So my goal is to shift that, because when you look at the school to prison pipeline, which is real, the new documentary that's come out, 13, that specifically addresses that, knowing that we have folks who are looking at third grade reading levels to determine whether or not someone's going to end up in the system. That has to be addressed, and that's only going to be addressed by putting more money and resources into education to make sure that our young people are being adequately equipped for the world. It means money, and shifting and reallocating money from places into places where we're being proactive and we're showing that we truly do value our future generations, rather than only investing in policing, which is in itself reactionary. If you have people that are totally well communities, as I like to say, who are communities that are able to thrive versus just survive, we see much more decreases in crime. We see increases in employment. We see increases in all sorts of other things, exposure to the arts and culture, because people are no longer just struggling to survive. So by investing in people first, and that's been a theme of my campaign, invest in people before corporate profit. So by investing in people, I mean putting our budget in people, and that means our young people in education, in health, in housing, to make sure that people are self-sustaining, that they have the ability and equal access and opportunity to be successful. That is key to me, and so that means moving money around, and where you put your money is reflective of what you value. And right now, we've been cutting education, we've cut parks and recs, budget and funding, and the only budget and funding that consistently increased has been policing. And so that has to change if we're going to change the trajectory of our city.
So we are live with Green Party candidate for mayor of the city of Baltimore, Joshua Harris. Send us your questions. I know your questions are already coming in, so we appreciate that, and we're going to try to get to them all. I wanted to follow up on that point because a lot of the policy that has to do with policing and how police officers operate is set on a state level. We have a very powerful Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, a very powerful police union here. A lot of that. So how he would have to take some of that fight to the Capitol and do it statewide. You know, people have been working on that for years. The Democratic candidate, Catherine Pugh, has been somewhat of a leader in the Maryland Assembly, and she was a state senator working on police reform. A lot of what people wanted hasn't quite gone through, but there have been some reforms passed this year in the wake of the Baltimore uprising, Freddie Gray's death. So a lot of people look to Catherine Pugh as sort of a leader on these issues. Talk about what you would do different than what the establishment has already presented.
Well, I think that Catherine Pugh has been in Annapolis and working for years, but yet we've still have very little accomplished when it comes to police reform. And I think it's important to note that. And so while cheerleading for issues is one thing, but to actually see policy reform and change is another thing. And we also have to have a mayor's office and administration that advocates and push the Baltimore City delegation to really advocate on behalf of those issues. And unfortunately, what we've seen in Baltimore is that previous administrations have been silent. We now have the Department of Justice report that has been released, which had, of course, scathing instances in there of police misconduct and brutality and all sorts of things. But unfortunately, as a young black man in Baltimore, I didn't need the Department of Justice report to tell me that these things were happening. And any elected official, be it Senator Catherine Pugh or any previous administration that acts as if it was surprising to see what was in the Department of Justice report, they are part of the problem. Because for administration after administration, we've seen them consistently write checks to individuals who've suffered police brutality from police misconduct, and write checks to keep them quiet and to pay off or to pay for the damages that were incurred based on those instances. So they've known this has happened time and time again, but yet they've been silent, and we didn't see a push until really the uprising of Freddie Gray's case, because before that it was Tyrone West, before that it was Anthony Anderson, and so many other hundreds of individuals that we may never know their name who've been victims of this. And so I think it really takes an administration that is committed to transparency and committed to pushing this beyond just the glitz and the glamour of while everyone's watching, but to real substantive policy reform and change. And it also takes a mayor that is either willing to work with the commissioner or bring in a new commissioner that's committed to a real culture change. We know that policy and training is one thing, but we have to change the culture of our policing and what that means, because right now there's a culture that exists that makes these things acceptable. Even the fact that the midnight or evening shift of police officers, that they call it the good old boy shift, where they send the officers who are known to be more aggressive. These are things that have to change culturally. That is problematic, that's acceptable. And we have to have leadership that is committed to holding people accountable and making sure, and there's things that we can do on the city level. There's talks of possibly disbanding the Baltimore City Police Department as an agency and starting over with a separate agency that isn't tied into the state, so that we can have more local control over that. There's also,
so I wanted to ask you about statewide policy, because you know, so to push back a little bit, advocates would say that because there wasn't a statewide movement supporting folks that wanted police reform, it wasn't possible. The FOP is very powerful, right? So we have a question from Vanessa Bliss. How would you use your campaign to build a statewide movement to help elect progressive council people and statewide elected officials to help build that momentum to make what you're saying possible?
Absolutely. I think that a Harris administration would be used as a bully pulpit to really get the message out there and push the message of the importance of true police reform. And unfortunately, and push in support of progressive candidates that are committed to that going into the state's house. Because unfortunately, we've been able to get very little traction with the representation that we've had thus far, and that includes my opponent, Senator Catherine Pugh. There's been very little measures taken to see substantive reform, and so we have to get leadership in there who's committed to or unapologetically afraid to go in there and make noise. And it's going to require stepping on some toes and upsetting some people to do what's right for the masses. And knowing that Baltimore City is a hub for the state of Maryland, the Harris administration has to be reflective and a voice for what is the largest population in the state of people in the state of Maryland, and advocate on behalf of this real change in Annapolis and work with the governor's administration. I also think that me not being a Democrat under a Harris administration would give Baltimore City a clean slate, or the ability to have a fresh start in working with our Republican governor, because there's not the contentious past or of battling of the two parties. And so we really have a fresh slate to say, hey, let's work together to get things done. I wasn't a part of that. Let's give Baltimore another chance. I'm a new administration that isn't tied to the Democratic machine, and I want to do what works for all of us, understanding that when Baltimore does better, the state of Maryland does better. And we all do better when we all do better, and we're in this together as Baltimore City, but then as a state more importantly, and really making sure that that message is delivered to Annapolis.
So again, we are live on Facebook with Green Party candidate for mayor, Joshua Harris. The questions are pouring in, so let's go to some of the questions that are coming in. Jill Harrison, how do we address Hogan, the governor of Maryland, pulling money from the city for transit, schools, and juvenile justice?
That's a great question. Ms. Harrison, thank you so much for that. That is, again, something I think that is a reflection of the contention between the Democratic and Republican parties that exist. Governor Hogan is a Republican, and if anyone knows Republicans, one of their most important points is fiscal accountability and responsibility. And unfortunately, Baltimore City has not been fiscally responsible. And I'm not naive to say that if I gave you $10 and you used it ineffectively or wasted it, and you came back and asked me for $100, I'm not inclined to give you that $100 to mismanagement again. And so under a Harris administration, a commitment to fiscal responsibility, accountability, and transparency is a must. And I guarantee that, again, without the contention of the Democratic-Republican relationship, we will have a fresh opportunity to work with the governor's office to say, hey, that wasn't us. We're cleaning things up. We're cleaning house up. We're committed to auditing our city and making sure we know where every dollar goes. Because I guarantee when we begin to dig in the crates, we will find millions of dollars that are being wasted or mismanaged that can now go into education, they can go into transportation, they can go into housing, they can go into workforce development and empowering people to do better and be better. And so again, it comes back to that accountability, responsibility, and transparency of a Harris administration with a commitment to fiscal responsibility.
And so we know people are joining in throughout this conversation, and you've already addressed a bit of this question, but I'll ask you again because we're getting several questions about property taxes. And so you've already spoken about that earlier, but specifically Chris Broughton is asking, essentially is asking, would you decrease property taxes because they are much higher in the city than in the county, and he's saying that it's much cheaper for him to invest and develop area outside the city. Would you have some incentives for people that want to invest in the city, but it's just for them, it's not financially viable because of the high property taxes?
Yes, to answer that question in short, property taxes is a major issue. We have the highest property taxes in the state, and they have to be reduced. And so in my economic development plan, again, understanding what we have the ability to do by taking that public banking model, we can do tremendous things, including reduce property taxes. Knowing that increases in property taxes, increases in water bills, cuts to education, cuts to parks and recs, all go to pay off debt that the city has incurred. Whether you're talking about the $660 million municipal bond that we're going to give or take out to give Port Covington a TIF, or whether you're talking about the $107 million TIF that we gave to Harbor Point, which has now had overages and put us even more in debt. It all goes to pay off that debt that the city has. So by removing ourselves from the Wall Street grip and taking control of our economic futures through public banking, it gives us the ability to leverage that. And as we generate more revenue and build more wealth and capital in the city, we can reduce property taxes. We can begin to renovate and rehab the houses and put Baltimoreans to work doing those renovations. And we now have them on as functional assets. We also have to be realistic about looking at institutions that are not paying into our tax base and figuring out ways to make sure that they are giving their fair share back into Baltimore City when it comes to taxes. We have, this is nonprofit town, and there's so many nonprofits that are not paying taxes into Baltimore City that we have to really address whether it's feasible or fiscally responsible to continue down this route and allow more large institutions that own and control massive amounts of land to get away without paying any taxes into Baltimore City.
Well, a related issue to that is, large institutions like Johns Hopkins, for example, that don't pay much taxes also do not pay so critics would say they don't pay a minimum wage. So there was a strike a few years ago. There was a measure to pass a $15 minimum wage in this city before it happened on a state level, which is what some critics said. They rather see it happen statewide because it might drive some businesses out of the city. But Johns Hopkins isn't going to move out of the city. Johns Hopkins is here. Would you push for a $15 minimum wage in Baltimore, even if the state hasn't passed it yet?
Absolutely. I think that that's something that has to be evaluated, though, to make sure that the residents of Baltimore reap the benefits of it, because we know that that's where it's needed. We know that we won't see reduction in crimes or improvement in education until we see an increase in the median family household income. And that comes through a living wage and providing living wage job opportunities. And that's a reality that I deal with and see every single day, individuals who can't provide for their family and folks who are working 2 and 3 jobs just to get by, and that has to change. Any individual that works 40 hours a week in Baltimore City should be able to thrive, not just survive. And so I'm committed to that. And institutions like Johns Hopkins, we really do have to evaluate because they own a large portion of land in Baltimore City. And they should be putting back into Baltimore City if they are truly committed to it. That means to living wages. That means through paying into the system, just like all of us are expected to do. And just because they're a large institution, they should not be given an out of that responsibility. And so these are things that I'm definitely looking at and evaluating as we prepare for what a Harris administration will look like in the first 100 days of policy and legislation, and being realistic on what the possibilities are. Making sure that we're not just giving more billionaires billion-dollar tax breaks or million-dollar tax breaks, because that's not who needs it. And it's not sustainable when we look at sustainable community development. A business first or institutional first approach to development is not sustaining. We have to have a people first or community-centered model of development in order to sustain ourselves in the long term.
And so we talked about some of the funding that our Republican governor, Larry Hogan, excuse me, has passed. But in the wake of the death of Freddie Gray, he also set aside a large sum of money on demolishing urban blight. And so we have a question from Mike Dowd. Would you work with the Hogan administration to further this plan? And that the idea is to demolish abandoned homes in West and East Baltimore. And so, but critics say it's just paving the way for further gentrification of those communities. What would your position be on that, on Hogan's plan?
So I want to work with the governor, but one of the things is that I don't believe that this is a plan. I think that this would say, well, we've got a bunch of vacant buildings, let's tear them down. And I don't think that there was any looking at the long-term effects of that or what we now do with this land or really evaluating that. That would be a plan, looking at long-term stability, looking at the people that will be impacted in that. Who gets the contracts? Are they hiring from locally from these communities? Because what we do know, and we've seen it all across the country, not just in Baltimore City, that it's not just about tearing down vacant buildings and putting up new pretty ones, because we know no matter how many old blighted buildings we tear down, no matter how many new pretty buildings we put up, if there isn't a focus on empowering people and giving them job opportunities and the opportunity to earn living wages in that work, then we are not solving problems, we're merely displacing them. Paving the way for gentrification in the 3 tiers that gentrification occurs in. And so that's something that is a reality for me and that I am keenly aware of. And so when I look at tactics or methods of just coming in and say we're going to put money aside to demolish the buildings, that doesn't cut it for me. We have to look at long-term effects. What is going to be the impact? Has there been a feasibility assessment done in this area? What is the median family household income? Do we have the skilled laborers in the area to participate in this work? Are there minority contractors from the area that are being included in this that will be able to reap the benefits and take some of that money home to their families as well? And making sure that all of these things are accounted for in a long-term plan for regional, sustainable regional development.
So we have another question from Margaret Flowers, who is the Green Party Senate candidate. We had a similar interview with her last week. She's asking, how would you handle the decriminalization of marijuana in Maryland in a way that doesn't create more underground economies? We talked about the school-to-prison pipeline, youth-to-prison pipeline, interactions with police for teenagers is a big pusher of that. How would you, and so, you know, Maryland's one of those states where marijuana is still illegal, but it's been decriminalized. So if you're smoking it outside, you know, you just get a ticket. You don't go to jail anymore.
I think that the legalization of marijuana is built into my platform in preparation for it. And it's something that is a reality in the near future. It's happening not just here, but all over the country. There is a push for it, and it's going to happen. While it's a state issue, the way that I view it on the city level is making sure that we localize it and that Baltimore reaps the benefits of a legalization of marijuana, as well as making sure that it is an equitable process. And so what we've seen all across the country is that wealthy institutions or wealthy individuals have come in and they've reaped the benefits of this emerging market or economy that where poor black and brown people specifically were previously marginalized and punished for mastering this trade. And so now my goal is to make sure that those people who were previously punished or marginalized for mastering this trade have the first opportunity to earn a legitimate living above ground with a legitimate business and reap the benefits and begin to build wealth in communities that were previously marginalized and quite frankly destroyed through the war on drugs of the likes of marijuana. And so when you look at places like Oakland, who is looking, where the city council is looking to vote on right now as we speak, for every marijuana growery or dispensary license that's given, making sure that a certain percentage of them go directly to individuals who were previously incarcerated for a drug offense. And so when we look at minimizing recidivism, when we look at small business and entrepreneurship, which we know is key to revitalizing local economies and growing a city, we want to make sure that there's equity in how this is done, and the city can put policy in place to ensure that we are localizing this emerging industry, this emerging business, and that we're preparing to make sure that all of Baltimore benefits from it, not just rich people who come in from the outside to corner the market, as well as making sure and understanding that, making sure that it doesn't become now a tax offense or a tax crime and people are not like Eric Garner, who was found to be selling cigarettes, that it doesn't now become a war on black and brown bodies being taxed for the legalization of marijuana or for having illegal, for having marijuana that is not being taxed. So putting policies in place to really prepare and protect communities in Baltimore City to ensure that we are spending our money locally and investing in local growth of this emerging industry. And
we've heard those kind of criticisms in Colorado and even in Maryland, because there's medicinal marijuana, and those licenses that were recently awarded have been challenged because you need something like $200,000. Every individual who gets a license needs $200,000, and there's not a lot of people from Baltimore that have that much money. And so a lot of people from out of state were coming in, and so I know in Maryland for the medical licenses, they've been challenged.
Yes.
And so talk more about beyond marijuana. What would your approach be for the war on drugs in general? We've seen a heroin epidemic in places like Baltimore and neighboring counties as well.
Absolutely, and that's a great point on the state level with the medicinal use of marijuana. Senator Catherine Pugh has had a seat at the table the entire time that this has happened, and yet minorities have still been excluded from being able to participate in the medicinal use of marijuana, and that has to change. And so again, there's a reflection of a place where the ball was dropped by someone on the state level who had a seat at the table right there where those things were happening. And so now looking to come into the city and create change, I asked the question, well, what about this and others? When it comes to drugs as a whole, we really have to begin to evaluate and look at them from a public health perspective, a public health crisis. Heroin did not just become an epidemic because it's gone into the suburbs or the surrounding counties of Howard County and Montgomery County. Heroin has been an epidemic in Baltimore City for years, and yet it's been treated as a criminal offense, and people have been criminalized for addiction, and it should be treated as a public health issue. There was legislation on the state level for what we call safe injection sites that would allow, that would help and be a benefit when it comes to harm reduction. It may sound crazy to some, but understanding that folks are going to do heroin and they're going to do these drugs whether you like it or not. So would you rather them doing it in your back alley or in a vacant home where they're contracting HIV, hepatitis, and all sorts of other diseases that they're passing through dirty needles, or would we rather reduce the harm and reduce the opportunity for those other diseases and illnesses to be passed on and create safe injection zones or safe injection sites where folks can go and there can be medical staff on hand to ensure that we're minimizing overdoses, to ensure that folks are appropriately or not suffering further harm through their addiction. And then we can begin to treat folks with addiction resources and help from there, because now we can identify who these folks are. We know who they are, and so now we can begin to work on moving past this addiction and helping folks get over it or beyond it. And so that's something that I'm definitely looking at. It's, again, a state issue, but as a mayor of Baltimore City, a Harris administration will use that seat as a bully pulpit to advocate on behalf of these issues being viewed as public health issues.
And so, it's a reminder to our viewers, we are live on Facebook. We're with the Green Party candidate Joshua Harris for mayor of Baltimore. So in a recent interview with us, former Mayor Sheila Dixon, who's also running a write-in campaign, said she would hire you if elected. Would you accept a job in a possible Dixon administration?
I think that that's something that I'd have to evaluate when the time comes. A lot of folks ask, well, kind of what's my end goal at this or my end game? And I really want folks to know, honestly, there's no end goal or end game other than maximize the positive impact that I can have on a city that I love. Knowing that this wasn't about climbing a ladder, this wasn't about me creating a name for myself. This was truly, and this is truly about people and empowering people through effective policy change. And so that's something I would have to evaluate for when the time comes. No matter what, I'm in this for the long term. I'm committed to Baltimore City. I'm committed to a city that I love. I'm committed to the people that make this city great. And so I will be around, and I will always be doing work for the citizens of Baltimore no matter what. But that's something I will look at when the time comes to effectively evaluate if it's somewhere where I want to be.
So we have a question from our investigative journalist, Stephen Janis. He says, Baltimore has an exceptionally powerful mayor. If you were elected, would you give up some of that power? For example, sole control of the Board of Estimates and fiscal appropriations. That would have an impact not only on your administration, but in future administrations as well.
Absolutely, that's a great question. Baltimore is a mayor-strong town. And one of the reasons people ask me all the time, well, why didn't you run for city council first, or why didn't you do this or that first and climb the ladder? For me, again, this is not a lifelong dream to be in elected politics. So when I evaluated the best way to maximize impact on Baltimore City and really change the trajectory of our city, it was from the seat of the mayor's office, knowing that it all comes back to economics and how capital is distributed, where resources go and where they don't go. And I think for administrations, we had a lack of understanding of the business of policy and how the business decisions that you make as a mayor in Baltimore City positively or negatively impact your constituents. And so for me, understanding that, my entire campaign has been centered around, again, shifting power and decision-making process away from the bureaucracy of City Hall and corporate entities who have controlled it thus far, and into the hands of people and neighborhoods. And so when you look at my platform, those people and neighborhoods that have been forgotten, neglected, and ignored for far too long, it's time for us to invest in them and let them have a voice and a say in how their tax dollars are spent. And so when we look at my platform, we have in there specifically participatory budgeting, which gives citizens the ability to come together in a councilmatic district and say, this is how our neighborhood operates, this is what we believe that we need since we live here every single day, and we would like to take this money and use it towards this development, whether it be building a theater, creating a park, creating a community garden, or an urban garden, or creating a supermarket. We would like this portion of our money to be put towards this, rather than someone in City Hall simply who has never been to this area making the decision about how that money should be used in a community that they've never been to. And so again, this is about putting power in the hands of the people that will be impacted most by these decisions and removing it away from the bureaucracy of City Hall.
And so talk about who is funding your campaign, because we know many of the other candidates you're running against have gotten lots of money from wealthy developers in this city.
So I'm excited to say we just had TV commercials actually launch on Tuesday. And those TV commercials weren't paid for by BG&E. They weren't paid for by Under Armour. They weren't paid for by any other corporation. They were paid for by everyday Baltimoreans, literally $22 at a time, proving that when people believe in something and when people unite together for the cause that they believe in and someone that they believe is going to represent their interests, that the only thing that beats big corporate money power is big people power. And so we have grown this grassroots campaign thanks to the support of everyday Baltimoreans. These aren't wealthy folks. These are folks who are working class Baltimoreans who believe in a Baltimore undivided and believe that Baltimore should work for all of us. And they have financed my campaigns, and we are now on radio and TV with advertisements. And so when I get there, that's who I work for. I don't owe BG&E, I don't owe Under Armour. I am going to work for the citizens of Baltimore because that's who put me there. And I think it's extremely important that folks understand the influence of big money and how it corrupts politics. But what our campaign is proving is that we can do this without corporate money, and that we can do this simply with people power, because the people are the many and the corporations are the few. And that's, again, what my campaign is about, people.
So we have a question about the environment from Nicole Hartig, and she writes, the Chesapeake Bay Agreement began in the late 80s, but many restoration projects have been postponed, some indefinitely. How would your focus on restoring the health of the Bay be different than previous administrations? We know that our current mayor, Stephanie Rawlings-Blake, had a goal of making the harbor swimmable by 2020, which it doesn't look like it's going to happen.
Yeah, I probably won't be swimming in the harbor by 2020.
Yeah.
Excuse me. And so I am running as a Green Party candidate, so the environment happens to be something that I value and that is near and dear to my heart as well. And so for me, unfortunately, usually the first budget cuts to go are those of environment and then education when it comes to things. And that has to change because, again, where we put our money is a reflection of what we value. And if we value this planet, if we value Mother Nature, if we value our city and we want it to exist for the next generation, we have to begin to protect and embrace that environment. And that means that we're going to have to put money in places that have previously been ignored and neglected to ensure that those changes are able to be made. And so again, this comes back to my economic development plan on where do we get the finances to be able to invest in environmental protection and environmental cleanup. Knowing that we have brownfields coverings all throughout the city of Baltimore from previous chemical plants that have existed that we can use federal dollars for as well, that have been untapped and gone largely unused. So there's also additional funds and sources of money there to help with environmental cleanup. But I am definitely committed to creating a greener Baltimore in more than one ways, whether you talk about bringing in more money, whether you talk about legalization of marijuana, or whether you talk about parks and green spaces. I am committed to a greener Baltimore and ensuring that the next generation has something that we can pass down to them, because we know that this planet isn't ours, it's just been loaned to us, and we have to give it to the next generation, and that's something that I want to make sure that we have the ability to do.
So we're talking to Joshua Harris. We just have a few minutes left, but send us your questions. We'll try to get to them all. We know, Josh, you have a busy couple days ahead of you, so we don't want to take up all your time, but we got a few more. Brody Gower, what would you do to make healthcare public so if someone you love gets sick, you don't go bankrupt? We know that's controlled more on a state and federal level, but people want to know what your position is on that.
No, absolutely. I'm a proponent of single-payer and universal health care. Unfortunately, on the city level, there's not much that I can do there. But again, I can use the Harris administration and my seat as mayor in Baltimore City as a bully pulpit to advocate on the state level for the possibilities. We know that on the state level, we can do great things there to provide access to affordable health care and quality health care, as well as provide education on healthy living which is a step that we often overlook. Getting folks to understand the importance of eating fresh fruits and vegetables, getting folks to understand the importance of healthy lifestyles and how that can prevent illness, knowing that I believe it's 60% of chronic illnesses are directly related to our diets. And so knowing that by creating education campaigns on the city level, we can begin to reduce harm and we can begin to increase health and healthy living and healthy access by beginning to focus on creating access to food in the 3/4 of our city that are food deserts. We can really change the future of the health of Baltimore City. We can increase our quality of life and so many other things by really having these campaigns and advocating on behalf of that, as well as working with the Baltimore City delegation in Annapolis to advocate on behalf of reforms towards access to health care in the state of Maryland. That is something that is also very important to me. I studied at the University of Oslo and lived in Oslo, Norway, where they have universal health care, and every person in Oslo is guaranteed quality health care. And I think that should be a reality in the place that we call the greatest country in the world. Why can't our citizens have access to quality health care? But again, we have to couple that with understanding health reform, healthy eating, and healthy lifestyles. And there has to be a focus on the campaign as such to educate and empower people to be healthier and live healthy lifestyles.
So Josh, I know we've had an extensive conversation here, but tell our viewers where they can find more information about your campaign, if there's anything we've left unanswered, and if you have any campaign events coming up in this last stretch. If people want to come see you, meet you, where can they find you?
Absolutely. Thank you again for the opportunity. My name is Joshua Harris. I'm a Green Party candidate for mayor here in Baltimore City. And right now we're on the verge of making history. And so we have just a few days away from the election day. We need your help. This is a grassroots campaign that has been people-powered. We have 292 polling locations across the city where we need volunteers on election day. So if you are willing to step up to the plate and volunteer with us and give us the most valuable thing you can contribute to this campaign, your time, we need your help. You can visit harrisforbaltimore.com and you can sign up to volunteer there. You can call 410-777-8531 and you can call our campaign office and tell them you're interested in volunteering. If you can't volunteer, you can send a contribution through harrisforbaltimore.com. And we look forward to seeing you out on the campaign trail and to seeing you and bringing your folks and friends and family out to the polls on Tuesday. And also, if you're interested in hanging out with us or seeing us, we'll be at Paparazzi tonight starting at 7 p.m. We're having a Party to the Polls event right here in Baltimore City at Paparazzi nightclub. So come on down, hang out with us, and get ready for Election Day. And then tomorrow morning, we're back at it, and we're going to knock doors Saturday, Sunday, Monday, leading into the election. And so we need your support and your help doing such.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us, and thank you for watching on Facebook.com and The Real News. Thank you so much.